On June 6, 1944, at 6:30 in the morning, a 23-year-old Comanche named Larry Sawpity crouched behind the steel ramp of a landing craft 200 yards off the Normandy coast. He was a radio operator with the 4th Signal Company, 4th Infantry Division. The ramp dropped. Sawpity hit wet sand, found a seawall, powered his radio, and spoke. But he did not speak English. Into the static and the roar of naval guns, Sawpity transmitted 2 sentences in a language that had never been heard on any European battlefield. Sak Nunui, Atatu Nunui. We made a good landing. We landed in the wrong place. 60 miles inland, in a stone building in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a quiet suburb just west of Paris, a German signals intelligence operator pressed his headphones tighter. He was one of the men assigned to Kona 5, the Wehrmacht's signal intelligence regiment for Western Europe, and his evaluation center, NAAS 5, had spent months mapping the Allied radio buildup across the English Channel. They had identified unit call signs, tracked divisions by their electronic fingerprints, cataloged frequencies. They were among the best trained intercept operators in the world. That morning, as the invasion began, the airwaves exploded. Thousands of transmissions poured across every band. Voice, Morse, encrypted bursts. But something was wrong. Mixed into the American frequencies they had been monitoring for months, there were signals that conformed to no linguistic system any German analyst had ever studied. Not encrypted, not coded, not scrambled. Just sounds, rhythmic, guttural, fast, that no one in the building could identify. The operator wrote down phonetic fragments, passed them up. No one at NAAS 5 could place the language. It was not English. Not French, not any European tongue, not any language their Japanese allies had briefed them on. It was, as far as German intelligence was concerned, a dead end before it started. If you're watching stories like this for the first time, hit subscribe and the like button. It helps these stories about American soldiers reach more people who care about remembering what they did. Now, hold that image. That operator in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, pencil frozen over his notepad, headphones full of words born 3 centuries ago on the plains of Oklahoma. Because to understand how he arrived at that moment, you need to understand what he had been before the Americans showed up. For 5 years, Germany's radio intelligence service had been the best in the world. That was not pride, that was operational fact. By 1944, roughly 12,000 German signal troops were engaged in intercepting, direction finding, decrypting, and evaluating enemy radio traffic on every front from Norway to North Africa. Think about that number for a moment. 12,000 men whose only job was to listen to the enemy talk. And the enemy talked plenty. They had cracked Czech military communications in hours, twice using the same method, because the Czechs made the same mistake both times. They had read Polish army traffic almost as fast as the Poles sent it, following mobilization orders in real time until the Polish radio system collapsed entirely by the 2nd day of the campaign. They had tracked the French High Command's main station as it fled from Paris to Tours in June of 1940, and they knew the moment General Weygand moved his headquarters because the radio signature moved with him. On the Eastern Front, Soviet operators were so generous with plain text transmissions that German intercept companies could reconstruct entire orders of battle. The NKVD's traffic alone was distinguishable by its unique call sign pattern, separate from the regular army, and the Germans read both. When the Soviets attacked Finland, German listeners in southern Galicia, 1,500 miles from the fighting, picked up the traffic clearly enough to map unit movements from the Baltic states to the Finnish front and back again, tracking individual divisions by name. Even the British, whose radio discipline was considered the tightest among the Allies, made critical mistakes. Their coastal defense nets transmitted call signs from the burn table in the clear, unencrypted, unchanging, which meant a German operator could identify the station, the network, and the chain of command within minutes of tuning in. Lieutenant General Albert Prawn, who became Germany's Chief of Army Signals in 1944, and later wrote the definitive post-war report on German radio intelligence, noted with something close to disbelief that the British seriously impaired the value of their well-disciplined radio organization through such oversights. In short, Every army that touched a radio transmitter became, sooner or later, readable. The only variable was time. Czechs took hours. Poles took days. The French took weeks. The Soviets practically handed it over. And then came the Americans. Remember this fact, because the rest of the story depends on it. Until the summer of 1942, Prawn's own report states, no difficulties were encountered in intercepting American radio communications. The nets were easy to identify. British and American units could be told apart by their abbreviations, their operating signals, their different ways of reading numbers aloud. The Americans were, in the professional vocabulary of German signals officers, cooperative. That word, cooperative, is the key to this entire story. Because everything that happened next is the history of how the most cooperative radio service on Earth became the most impenetrable. Not because Americans learned discipline, not because they tightened procedures, but because they became more American, and the German system had no model for what that meant. The wall the Germans hit was not one wall. It was 5 stacked on top of each other, and each was made of something different. The first was invisible. It had nothing to do with codes or ciphers or secret languages. It came from a single engineer in a radio factory in Chicago who talked the United States Army into doing something no military on Earth had ever attempted. And the moment the Army said yes, every German intercept receiver pointing west went quiet. In 1940, the United States Army had a radio problem. Its tactical sets, the ones infantrymen and tank crews used in the field, ran on amplitude modulation, AM, the same technology as every other army on Earth. And AM had a flaw that mattered enormously in combat. It was loud, not in volume, in visibility. An AM signal spread wide, bounced off the ionosphere, traveled enormous distances, and could be picked up by any receiver tuned to the right frequency band. For a German intercept station sitting 200 miles behind the front, American AM traffic was an open window. This was how the world worked in 1940. Radios talked, enemies listened. The only protection was encryption, and encryption was slow, fragile, and unavailable below division level. A sergeant calling for mortar support did not have a cipher machine in his foxhole. He had a radio and his voice, and anyone within range could hear him. A man named Daniel Noble thought there was a better way. Noble was an engineer at Galvin Manufacturing Corporation in Chicago, the company that would later rename itself Motorola. He was not military, he had no rank, but he understood something about frequency modulation, FM, that almost no one in the Army's Signal Corps had considered. FM signals traveled on very high frequencies, VHF, and VHF behaved differently from the frequencies the world's armies used. It did not bounce off the ionosphere. It did not travel hundreds of miles. It went in a straight line from antenna to antenna, and then it stopped. Line of sight, which meant that a German intercept station 60 miles behind the front could point every receiver it owned at the American sector and hear exactly nothing, because the FM signal from a rifleman's radio never reached that far. Here is the detail that matters. Noble did not just have a theory. He had the backing of Edwin Howard Armstrong, a Columbia University professor who had invented wideband FM in 1933. Armstrong had demonstrated the technology in 1935 in front of a stunned audience. They heard a glass of water being poured, a piece of paper being torn, sounds that would have been unrecognizable garbage over AM coming through the FM receiver with perfect clarity. When the war came, Armstrong offered his FM patents to the War Department for free. No licensing fee, no royalties. The most significant radio technology of the 20th century handed to the United States military at zero cost. Noble used that gift. He met with Signal Corps representatives and argued, pushed, insisted that the Army's next generation of tactical radios should abandon AM entirely and build on FM. The Signal Corps had already drawn up specifications for a new infantry backpack radio using AM. Noble convinced them to tear up those specs and start over. The first result was the SCR-508, a vehicle-mounted FM set for tanks and jeeps, introduced in March of 1942. It operated between 20 and 28 megahertz, and for the first time in history, an armored column could talk to itself without broadcasting its position to every intercept unit on the continent. The second result changed infantry warfare. The SCR-300, the radio that would earn the nickname walkie-talkie, weighed 38 pounds, rode on a soldier's back, operated between 40 and 48 megahertz, and gave a company commander a clear voice link to battalion headquarters up to 5 miles away. It went into combat for the first time at Anzio in January of 1944, and from that day forward, American infantry fought a different kind of war than anyone else on Earth. But this is the number you need to hold in your mind. Every rifle company in the United States Army also carried 6 SCR-536s, the handy-talkie, a 5-pound handheld radio small enough to operate with one hand. 6 per company, 1 for each rifle platoon, 2 for the weapons platoon, 1 for the company commander. The 29th Infantry Division alone, one division landing at Omaha Beach, carried hundreds of these radios across the sand on June 6th. No other army on Earth operated this way. The British did not have handheld radios at platoon level. The Germans did not. The Soviets did not. The Japanese did not. The American military had taken a consumer electronics company from Chicago and turned its infantry into the most radio-saturated force in history. Now think about what this meant for the German listeners. Before FM, a German intercept operator could sit at his station and tune across the American frequency bands like turning the dial on a home radio. He could hear tank commanders, forward observers, supply convoys, headquarters traffic, all of it floating through the air on AM waves that traveled far beyond the battlefield. After FM, those same frequencies went dark. The tactical chatter, the real-time, minute-by-minute voice traffic that told you where units were, what they were doing, and where they were going, simply vanished from German receivers. In July of 1943, the Germans captured several SCR-536s and at least one SCR-300 during the fighting in Sicily. They examined them carefully. Their own technical reports described the American radios as, in their words, extremely effective. They understood the engineering. They understood the principle. But understanding a technology and replicating an entire industrial system are two different things. Germany never mass-produced a tactical FM radio to match. By the time they grasped what FM meant for the battlefield, American factories had built over 130,000 handy-talkies alone. So the first wall was up. German ears, trained to hear everything, suddenly heard silence where American voices should have been. But here is where the story deepens, because FM did not cover everything. Higher-level communications, regiment to division, division to corps, still traveled on longer-range frequencies that German stations could intercept, and American soldiers, being American soldiers, were not always careful about what they said on those frequencies. So the Germans leaned harder into voice intercept, expecting that what they lost at the company level, they could recover at the battalion level and above. They pointed their best English-speaking operators at American voice traffic, and what those operators heard was a second wall, one that no amount of equipment could solve. To understand the problem German operators faced, you need to understand what kind of English they spoke. Germany's Signals Intelligence Service recruited its English language specialists from a narrow pool. University-educated men, most of them. Men who had learned English from textbooks, from literature, from the BBC World Service. Their English was precise, grammatical, and, in its way, excellent. They could read Churchill's speeches. They could parse a Royal Navy situation report. They could follow a British Armoured Brigade's net traffic because the British spoke on the radio the way they wrote official memoranda, clipped, formal, structured. When a British officer transmitted coordinates, he did it the same way every time, using the same format, the same phonetic alphabet, the same procedural language. German intercept operators trained on British traffic described it as disciplined and predictable. Predictable was good. Predictable meant readable. Then they tuned in to the Americans. Picture this. A German operator, Let's say he spent 4 years at the University of Heidelberg studying English literature. He can discuss Shakespeare. He has read Hemingway. He listens to a transmission from an American infantry battalion somewhere in France, and what comes through his headphones is a 20-year-old from Flatbush, Brooklyn, talking at twice the speed of any British officer, dropping consonants, swallowing vowels, using words that exist in no dictionary the German has ever seen. The kid on the radio calls a machine gun a chatterbox. He calls pancakes collision mats. He says a position is all balled up, and that the platoon sergeant bought the farm, and that someone needs to send up the pineapples, which means grenades, but only if you grew up in a country where that slang existed. And that was before the profanity. American soldiers had invented an entire vocabulary of acronyms that functioned as a parallel language. Snafu, situation normal, all fouled up. Fubar, fouled up beyond all recognition. Tarfu, things are really fouled up. These words appeared in radio traffic constantly. They were not code. They were not designed to confuse the enemy. They were just how Americans talked. But for a German linguist trained on Oxford English, hearing a transmission that went, "The whole show is foobar, tell the old man we need the plumber up here before Jerry drops another load," that was not a sentence. That was noise. And here is where it gets worse. The United States of America in 1944 was not one country linguistically, it was 50. A kid from Boston pronounced words differently than a kid from Mississippi. A rancher's son from Montana used expressions that a factory worker from Detroit had never heard. And the Army threw all of them together, Texans and New Yorkers and Minnesotans and boys from the Louisiana Bayou, and put radios in their hands and said, "Talk." The result was something no German training program could prepare for. Every American radio net sounded different from every other American radio net, because the men on them came from different places, used different slang, spoke at different speeds, and followed procedures with a looseness that horrified the British almost as much as it baffled the Germans. British liaison officers who monitored American radio nets during the Normandy campaign noted with alarm that American operators frequently abandoned proper call signs, used first names, made jokes, argued, and transmitted information that should have been encrypted, all in plain voice, all in a dialect that was, technically, English, but practically its own language. Now, think about what this meant from the German side. A German signals officer could assign his best English speaker to an American frequency. That operator could record hours of voice traffic. He could transcribe every word he heard. And when he brought the transcription to the evaluation center, the analyst would stare at sentences full of baseball metaphors, regional slang, profanity acronyms, and improvised nicknames for equipment, positions, and officers, and extract almost nothing of tactical value. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the irony. The German military was, in many ways, the most linguistically disciplined fighting force in history. German radio procedure was rigid by design. Call signs followed a system. Frequencies were assigned and adhered to. Messages were formatted according to regulation. When a German tank commander transmitted, he used the same words, in the same order, with the same abbreviations as every other German tank commander. This was considered a strength. It meant that any German operator could understand any German transmission instantly. But it also meant that the German mind was trained to look for patterns. Patterns in language, patterns in procedure, patterns in structure. And the American radio service had no pattern. Or rather, its pattern was the absence of pattern. The informality was not a flaw, it was the culture. And culture cannot be decrypted. A German cryptanalyst could break a cipher because ciphers follow mathematical rules. A German linguist could learn formal English because formal English follows grammatical rules. But no one could learn to think like a 20-year-old from Brooklyn who called a tank a bucket and an officer he disliked that sad sack, and who signed off his transmissions not with a regulation call sign, but with a nickname his squad had given him in boot camp. That was not a code, it was a life. Here is the fact that ties this together. German signals intelligence had built its entire system on one assumption, that military communication is formal, structured, and therefore analyzable. The British confirmed that assumption. The Soviets confirmed it. The French confirmed it. Every army Germany had ever listened to confirmed it. The Americans broke it. Not by trying to, not by design, but because the United States Army was built from a civilian population that did not think in straight lines, did not speak in regulation, and did not treat a radio as a sacred instrument of command. They treated it the way they treated a telephone back home, as a thing you picked up and talked into, the way you talked, 2 walls down. The Germans could not hear the tactical frequencies, and when they could hear the operational ones, they could not understand what was being said. But the story does not end here, because even if every German operator had been born in Brooklyn and raised on baseball, even then, the sheer scale of what was coming through those frequencies would have buried them. Here is a number that will help you understand what German intelligence was up against. In the weeks immediately before D-Day, radio traffic from the European Theater of Operations alone, just headquarters, just the buildup, averaged between 1.5 million and 2 million cipher groups per day. Per day. That was before a single soldier stepped onto a landing craft. That was before any tactical radio was switched on. That was just the bureaucracy of invasion talking to itself. Now multiply it. When the landings began, when 150,000 men hit 5 beaches in a single morning, and every one of those men belonged to a unit that had radios, and every radio was transmitting, the volume of American signals traffic did not double. It did not triple. It became a flood so vast that the German intercept system, built for a world where armies transmitted dozens or hundreds of messages a day, found itself trying to drink from a fire hose. Consider the arithmetic at the company level alone. A standard American rifle company carried 6 SCR 536 handheld radios. One division had roughly 36 rifle companies, that is 216 handheld radios in a single division's rifle companies. And that count does not include the battalion-level SCR 300s, the regimental SCR 284s, the artillery forward observer sets, the tank radios in every Sherman, the tactical air control frequencies linking ground troops to fighter bombers, the naval gunfire nets linking the beach to the destroyers offshore. By the time you added every radio in a single American infantry division and its supporting units, you were looking at over 1,000 transmitters generating voice and Morse traffic simultaneously across dozens of frequency bands. On June 6th, 6 American and British divisions landed in Normandy. Within a week, there were more. Within a month, over 1 million men were ashore. Each division brought its own constellation of radios. Each corps headquarters added another layer. Each army added another. The American First Army alone, one of 2 American armies in France by August, operated radio nets so dense that its own signal officers sometimes struggled to manage them. Now place yourself back in that stone building in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. You are a German intercept operator. You have good equipment. You have training. You have been doing this for years. Your mission is to listen to the enemy, extract useful intelligence, and deliver it to your commanders before it goes stale. That last part, before it goes stale, is the detail that broke the system. Because intelligence has a shelf life. A message intercepted at 8 in the morning that says, 3rd Battalion is moving through grid square such and such at 0900 is useful at 8:15. By noon, it is history. The battalion has moved. The grid square is empty. The intelligence is dead. This was true in every war on every front, but it was never more brutally true than against the Americans. Because Americans moved fast. Faster than the Germans expected. Faster than their intelligence cycle could process. Here is how that cycle worked. A German intercept operator heard a transmission. If it was voice, he transcribed it, assuming he could understand it, which, as we have already established, was far from guaranteed. If it was encrypted, he forwarded the intercept to the cryptanalysis section, where specialists attempted to break it. Broken or transcribed, the message went to the evaluation center, where analysts compared it against known unit identifiers, map references, and previous intercepts to build a picture. That picture was then forwarded to the relevant army or army group headquarters. The entire process, when it worked well, took hours. When it did not work well, When traffic was heavy, when frequencies overlapped, when messages were garbled, it took a day or more. By the time that day had passed, the Americans were somewhere else entirely. This was the asymmetry that no amount of manpower could fix. Germany had 12,000 signals intelligence troops spread across every front: east, west, southeast, Mediterranean. The Western Front got a fraction of that number. Kona 5, responsible for all of France and the Low Countries, was one regiment. One regiment against the combined radio output of 2 American armies, a British Army group, and a Canadian army. Even before the invasion, Prawn's own report noted that the sheer volume of Allied traffic forced German intercept units to prioritize ruthlessly. Covering one net meant abandoning another. After the invasion, prioritization became triage, and triage became surrender. There is a phrase in signals intelligence: noise-to-signal ratio. When the ratio tips too far, when there is so much noise that the signal drowns, you stop trying to find the signal. You cannot process it. You cannot evaluate it. You cannot deliver it. You can only listen to the roar and know that somewhere inside it, there are words that matter, and you will never find them in time. By the late summer of 1944, German radio intelligence on the Western Front was functionally blind to American tactical movements. They could still intercept some higher-level traffic. They could still attempt to break M209 cipher messages, and they did, reading perhaps 10 to 30% of them, though rarely fast enough to matter. But the real-time picture, the minute-by-minute awareness of what American units were doing on the ground, had slipped beyond their reach. The hose was too wide. The water was too fast. 3 walls. The Germans could not hear the short-range tactical traffic because FM signals never reached their stations. They could not understand the voice traffic they did intercept because American English was not the English they had learned. And even when fragments came through clear enough to transcribe, the volume was so enormous and the speed of American operations so relentless that the intelligence was dead before it reached a general's desk. Any one of these walls would have been a serious problem. Together, they were crippling. But the Germans had not yet encountered the worst of it, because mixed into that ocean of static and slang, on frequencies the Germans could actually receive, there were transmissions in languages that were not merely unfamiliar. They were languages that had never been written down, languages that came from a place no German linguist had ever studied and no German university had ever taught. And the first time German operators heard them, they did not know they were hearing a language at all. The story of how those languages ended up on a European battlefield begins 26 years earlier, in a forest in France during a different war. October 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The American 36th Infantry Division was pinned in fighting along the Aisne River, and the Germans were reading every message the Americans sent. They had tapped the telephone lines. They had broken the codes. Every time the 36th tried to coordinate an attack, the Germans knew it was coming before the orders reached the front. A colonel named Alfred Wainwright Bloor, commanding the 142nd Infantry Regiment, was walking through his headquarters area when he overheard 2 of his soldiers talking. They were Choctaw from Oklahoma, and they were speaking their native language. Bloor stopped. He could not understand a single word, and in that moment he realized, if he could not understand them, neither could the Germans. Within hours, Bloor had Choctaw speakers posted at field telephones along the line. On October 26, 1918, the first combat message in an indigenous American language was transmitted, an order to withdraw 2 companies from Chufili to Chardeni. The movement succeeded without interference. A German officer captured shortly afterward confirmed what Bloor suspected. The Germans, he said, had been completely confused by the Indian language and gained no benefit whatsoever from their wiretaps. Within 72 hours, the tide of battle had turned. Now, here is the part that matters for our story. After that war ended, German and Japanese intelligence took notice. Between the wars, both nations sent students, researchers, and agents to the United States to study Native American languages. They visited reservations. They sat in on university courses. They attempted to build linguistic profiles of as many tribal languages as they could. They failed. Not because they were incompetent, but because the task was impossible. There were hundreds of indigenous languages in North America. Many had never been written down. They had no standard grammars, no published dictionaries. Their tonal structures, their syntax, their verb systems were so far removed from any European or Asian language family that even trained linguists needed years of immersion to achieve basic comprehension. And the Americans knew it. A military intelligence assessment noted that the Navajo dialect was regarded as completely unintelligible to outsiders, and that fewer than 30 non-Navajo Americans were believed to have any real knowledge of the language. The Germans had penetrated precisely 0 of them. So when the next war came, the United States did it again, but this time by design. In the winter of 1940, the Army recruited 17 young Comanche men from Oklahoma. They were sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, and assigned to the 4th Signal Company, 4th Infantry Division. Their drill sergeant was surprised by how quickly they adapted to military life. Many had attended government boarding schools run with military discipline, the same schools that had tried to strip away their language and culture. Now the Army wanted that language back. At Fort Benning, the Comanches did something remarkable. They built a code inside a code. The Comanche language itself was incomprehensible to outsiders. That was the first layer. But on top of it, they created 250 specialized terms for military concepts that had no Comanche equivalent. Bombers became pregnant birds. Bombs were baby birds. Tanks were turtles. Machine guns were sewing machines. Adolf Hitler was crazy white man. And for words that had no coterm at all, they spelled them out letter by letter using random Comanche words, so that even a Comanche who was not part of the program could not follow the conversation. A military cipher machine took up to 4 hours to encode and decode a message. A Comanche code talker did it in under 3 minutes. 13 of these men landed on Utah Beach on June 6, 1944. And this is where the story circles back to where we began, because the first coded message transmitted from the beach that morning was sent by Private First Class Larry Saupitty, the same 23-year-old we met in the opening of this story. We made a good landing, we landed in the wrong place. That message traveled from Saupitty's radio to another Comanche in the division signal net, was translated into English, and relayed up the chain of command, all in minutes. Any German operator who intercepted it heard only the sound of a language that had no written form, no European cognate, no entry point for analysis. The Comanches fought across France and into Germany. They were at Cherbourg, they were at St. Lo, they were in the Hurtgen Forest and at the Battle of the Bulge. Several were wounded. None were killed. Their code was never broken. And they were not alone. 8 Meskwaki men, from a tribe in Iowa so small that those 8 represented 1 out of every 6 Meskwaki adults, served as code talkers with the 168th Infantry, 34th Red Bull Division in North Africa and Italy. They transmitted under artillery fire, laid wire across contested ground, and worked in pairs. One translating English into Meskwaki, transmitting, the other receiving and translating back. 3 of them were captured. They spent months in German and Italian prison camps, but the code held. The Germans never broke it because there was nothing to break. There was no system. There was no algorithm. There was only a living language, spoken by a few hundred people on Earth, carried into war by men who had been told as children that their language was worthless. That is 4 walls. FM that German receivers could not hear, slang that German linguists could not parse, volume that German analysts could not process, and languages that German intelligence could not even identify, much less decode. But there was still one more, and this one was not invisible, not cultural, not linguistic. It was mathematical. Sitting inside American signal centers, bolted to desks, guarded by men with orders to destroy it rather than let it be captured, there was a machine. The Germans had given it a name. They called it AM2, American Machine 2. They had thrown their best cryptanalysts at it for years, and they had gotten exactly nowhere. The machine the Germans could not break looked nothing like what you might expect. It was not elegant. It was not small. It weighed over 100 pounds, stood 2 feet tall on a desk, and required a trained operator to use. It had a keyboard like a typewriter, a printer that punched out ciphertext on a paper strip, and inside its casing, 15 rotors. 15. Arranged in 3 banks of 5, each bank controlling the movement of the others in a cascade of mathematical complexity that produced, for each keystroke, an encryption so layered that brute force analysis was functionally impossible with any technology that existed in 1944. The Americans called it Sigaba. The Germans, who never saw one, called it AM2, American Machine 2. They threw their best cryptanalysts at intercepted Sigaba traffic for years. They got nothing, not a single message, not a partial break, not even a foothold. After the war, captured German intelligence officers were interrogated specifically about Sigaba. The answer was consistent: total failure. The machine was, as far as the Third Reich's code-breaking apparatus was concerned, a black wall with no door. And the Americans made sure it stayed that way. Every Sigaba unit came with standing orders for its destruction in the event of capture. This was not a vague guideline. Bolted to the machine, or stored within arm's reach, was a 40-pound thermite charge. If an operator believed the position was about to be overrun, his order was clear: trigger the charge. The thermite ignited at 1400 degrees centigrade, hot enough to melt the rotors, the wiring, the casing, everything, into a pool of slag. Not one Sigaba machine fell into enemy hands during the entire war. Not one. Think about what that means in practical terms. The messages between Eisenhower and Marshall, encrypted on Sigaba. The coordination between Allied army groups for the Normandy invasion, Sigaba. The strategic communications that governed the entire European theater, Sigaba. The Germans could intercept the transmissions. They could record them. They could stare at the ciphertext for weeks, and they could extract exactly as much meaning from it as from random noise. But here, and this is where the story takes its most surprising turn, the Americans had a second cipher machine. One they used not for strategic traffic, but for tactical communications at division level and below. It was called the M209. It was small, mechanical, portable, built by Smith Corona in Groton, New York, at a rate of 400 units per day. Over 140,000 were produced during the war. And this machine, unlike Sigaba, the Germans could break. By early 1943, German cryptanalysts had found a way in. The M209 had a weakness. If 2 messages were encrypted with the same settings, what cryptanalysts call a depth, the mathematical structure could be exploited. German specialists developed techniques using strips of paper, sliding them against each other to test probable words at each position in the ciphertext. Later, at NAAS 5 in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a cryptanalyst named Reinhold Weber went further. He designed and built an electromechanical machine, a device specifically engineered to accelerate the breaking of M209 traffic. By August of 1944, Weber's machine was operational. And here is the fact that makes this story not a German triumph, but a German tragedy. By August of 1944, the Allies were breaking out of Normandy. Patton's Third Army was racing across France. Paris would be liberated within weeks. And NAAS 5, Weber's unit, the evaluation center that had spent months building a machine to crack American tactical ciphers, had to evacuate Saint-Germain-en-Laye. They tried to destroy their records. They ran out of time. They buried what they could not burn. American intelligence teams later dug up roughly 2,000 sheets of partially readable documents from the site. Weber's machine worked. But the war moved faster. And this is the detail that reveals something deeper about the American approach to signal security, something the German mind struggled to accept. The Americans knew the M209 was breakable. They had always known. The machine was never intended to be unbreakable. It was intended to be fast. A message encrypted on the M209 could be sent and decoded in minutes. A message encrypted on Sigaba took much longer and required equipment too heavy and too valuable for a division command post under fire. So the Americans made a deliberate choice. Use the breakable machine for tactical traffic that would be obsolete in hours, and protect everything that mattered with Sigaba. The German cryptanalysts reading 10 to 30% of M209 traffic were reading yesterday's newspaper. The units had moved. The orders had been executed. The grid coordinates pointed to empty fields. And the traffic that actually governed the war, the strategic layer, remained behind a wall they could not scratch. Consider the contrast with Germany's own approach. The Wehrmacht trusted its Enigma machine to protect communications at every level, from U-boats in the Atlantic to army groups on the Eastern Front. German commanders believed Enigma was unbreakable. It was not. The British and Americans were reading Enigma traffic on an industrial scale, thousands of messages per day, through the Ultra program, and the intelligence they extracted shaped battles from El Alamein to the Bulge. Germany put all its faith in one lock and never knew it had been picked. The Americans did the opposite. They assumed their tactical lock would be picked. They used it anyway, because speed at the front mattered more than perfection. And they kept a second lock, Sigaba, on everything that could not afford to be read. One lock for the battlefield, disposable by design. One lock for the war, impregnable by engineering. 5 walls, FM silence, linguistic chaos, overwhelming volume, unidentifiable languages, and a cryptographic fortress with 2 layers, one sacrificial, one absolute. Any one of these walls would have degraded German intelligence. 2 would have been serious. All 5 together did something that no enemy had ever done to Germany's radio service. They made it irrelevant. But the deepest question, the real answer to why German radio operators gave up decoding American chatter, is not about any single wall. It is about what all 5 walls had in common. And what they had in common was not a technology or a tactic. It was something far harder for a German officer in 1944 to understand. After the war, in a house in the small Bavarian town of Neumarkt Sankt Veit, Albert Praun sat down to write. He was 55 years old. He had entered the German army in 1913 as an officer candidate in the 1st Bavarian Telegraph Battalion. He had served as a signal officer in the First World War, remained in the post-war Reichswehr, commanded a division on the Eastern Front, and in 1944 been appointed Chief of Army and Armed Forces Signal Communications, the highest signals post in the Wehrmacht. Now the war was over, Germany was in ruins, and the American Historical Division had asked him to produce a comprehensive report on German radio intelligence. Praun spent months assembling the material. He enlisted former colleagues, colonels, majors, captains who had commanded intercept units from Norway to North Africa. He gathered their accounts, cross-referenced their recollections, and produced a document that would eventually be declassified by the NSA and become the definitive German-side record of signals intelligence in the Second World War. The report is meticulous. It covers every front, every campaign, every enemy. And when Praun reaches the Americans, something changes in the tone. Against the Poles, his language is clinical. Against the French, dismissive. Against the British, respectful but confident. Their discipline was good, but their mistakes were exploitable. Against the Soviets, almost contemptuous. Their carelessness was a gift. Against the Americans, the tone is different. It is the tone of a man describing something he could see clearly, but never fully understood. Praun noted the early ease of intercepting American traffic. He noted the transition, the moment when that ease vanished. He cataloged the technical challenges, the FM frequencies his stations could not reach, the volume that overwhelmed his units, the cipher machines his analysts could not crack. But woven through the technical language, there is a recurring observation that Praun never quite states directly, but circles again and again. The Americans did not behave the way an army was supposed to behave. And that is the answer. Not FM, not slang, not volume, not code talkers, not Sigaba. Those were symptoms. The cause was something underneath all of them, something structural, something cultural, something that lived in the gap between how the German military understood the world and how the Americans actually operated in it. The German system, military, industrial, intellectual, was built on order, hierarchical command, standardized procedure, centralized control. This was not a weakness. It was what made the Wehrmacht devastating in 1940 and 1941. It was what made German radio intelligence capable of reading every army it faced, because every army it faced was built on the same principles. The Poles used centralized communication nets. The French routed traffic through a single war ministry station. The British organized their radio procedures with the same institutional tidiness that organized everything British. Even the Soviets, for all their chaos, operated within a rigid, hierarchical structure that German analysts could map and predict. The American system was built on something else. Not disorder, that is too simple. It was built on distributed authority, on the assumption that a sergeant in a foxhole might need to make a decision without waiting for a colonel, and that the sergeant's decision would be good enough. On the assumption that a 22-year-old company commander with a radio could call for artillery, adjust fire, redirect an entire battalion's support in minutes on his own authority, in his own words. The radios were not just communication tools. They were instruments of a command philosophy that pushed decision-making downward to the lowest possible level and trusted the men at that level to act. This is why the FM revolution was American and not British or German. It was not because American engineers were smarter. It was because the American military wanted radios at the platoon level, a level where no other army thought radios belonged, and the only way to make that work was FM. The technology followed the doctrine. The doctrine followed the culture. This is why the slang was impenetrable. It was not because Americans were careless. It was because the Army had taken 12 million men from every corner of a vast, diverse, polyglot nation, factory workers and farmers, immigrant sons and college boys, men who spoke the English of Harlem and the English of Appalachia, and put them all on the same frequency. The diversity was not a failure of training. It was the composition of the country. This is why the volume was crushing. It was not because Americans were wasteful with radio time. It was because the industrial base behind them could produce 130,000 handheld radios and ship them to the front, an output that German industry, starved of raw materials and under constant bombardment, could not approach. The production followed the capacity. The capacity followed the economy. And this is why the code talkers worked. Not just because the Comanche or Meskwaki languages were obscure, though they were, but because the United States was the only nation on Earth that contained, within its own borders, hundreds of indigenous languages spoken by citizens who were willing to serve in its military. The diversity that had been used to marginalize these men, the boarding schools, the forced assimilation, the suppression of their cultures, had failed to erase their languages. And those surviving languages became weapons that no enemy could replicate because no enemy had them. 5 walls, 1 foundation. The foundation was a country too large, too diverse, too decentralized, and too productive for any hierarchical intelligence system to model. The Germans could not decode American chatter because American chatter was not a system. It was a culture, messy, informal, fast, multilingual, and vast, transmitted at the speed of sound across frequencies the Germans could not hear, in dialects they could not parse, in languages they could not name, at a volume they could not process, behind ciphers they could not break. Prawn never wrote those words, but his report, read carefully, says exactly that, in the space between what he documented and what he could not explain. There is one more thing to tell, and it is quiet. It is about what happened after the radios went silent. The war ended on May 8, 1945. The radios went quiet, and the men behind them went home, those who survived, to lives that the war had interrupted but not erased. Albert Prawn was taken into American custody. He spent 5 years as a prisoner, then as a consultant, writing the report that would document everything German radio intelligence had accomplished and everything it had failed to do. He died in 1975 in Munich at the age of 80. His report, declassified, archived, largely forgotten, sits in the files of the National Security Agency, a 600-page monument to a system that mastered every enemy it faced except the one it could not model. Reinhold Weber, the cryptanalyst who built the machine to break the M209 at NAAS-5, survived the evacuation from Saint-Germain-en-Laye. His device, painstakingly assembled from precision parts in a former cigar factory near Frankfurt, worked. It broke American tactical ciphers. And it did not matter. The war had moved too fast. Weber's story did not become public until 2004, when he published an account of his work. By then, the machine he had built existed only in memory. Edwin Howard Armstrong, the Columbia professor who invented FM radio and handed his patents to the United States military for free, the man whose technology built the first wall and made American tactical communications invisible, never saw recognition for what his gift meant on the battlefield. After the war, he was consumed by patent litigation against RCA, which had adopted FM for commercial broadcasting without adequate compensation. On January 31, 1954, Armstrong put on his overcoat and hat, opened the window of his 13th floor apartment on the East River in New York, and stepped out. He was 63. The man who gave the American soldier a voice the enemy could not hear died in silence. Daniel Noble went back to Galvin Manufacturing, to Motorola, as it renamed itself after the war. He became the company's executive vice president and helped build it into one of the largest communications firms in the world. The SCR-300, his wartime creation, evolved into the police radios, the emergency service radios, and eventually the cellular technology that Motorola would pioneer decades later. Every time you pick up a phone and speak to someone without thinking about who might be listening, you are living in the world Daniel Noble helped build. And the code talkers came home. The 13 Comanche men of the 4th Signal Company, the ones who landed on Utah Beach, fought through Cherbourg and St. Lo, survived the Hurtgen Forest and the Bulge, came home to Oklahoma. Several had been wounded. All carried Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. None had been killed. In July of 1946, the town of Walters, Oklahoma, held the first Comanche homecoming to welcome them back. There was singing. There was dancing in the old way, the warriors' way that the government boarding schools had tried to stamp out. The men who had used their language as a weapon stood in a circle and heard it spoken in celebration. But the world did not hear their story. Their service was classified. For decades, the Comanche code talkers lived ordinary lives, working, raising families, growing old, and could not tell anyone what they had done. The same was true for the 8 Meskwaki men of the 34th Division, 3 of whom had endured German and Italian prison camps without revealing the existence of the code. They came home to the small Meskwaki settlement in Iowa, a community so tight that their 8 families represented a significant share of the entire tribe, and said nothing. It was not until 1968 that the military declassified the code talker programs. Even then, recognition was slow. The Navajo code talkers of the Pacific received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2001. The Comanche and Meskwaki code talkers waited longer. In 2013, nearly 70 years after the war, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to code talkers from 33 tribes, including the Comanches and the Meskwaki. By then, every one of the original Comanche code talkers had passed away. Charles Chibity, the last of them, died in 2005 at the age of 83. A few years before his death, he said something that holds more weight than any paragraph in Prawn's 600-page report. He said, "My language helped win the war, and that makes me proud, very proud." His language, the one they tried to take from him. Larry Sopity, the young man on Utah Beach, the voice that opened this story, the first words in Comanche ever transmitted on a European battlefield, survived the war, came home to Oklahoma, and lived quietly until his death. He had been Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s personal radio operator, driver, and orderly. Roosevelt himself died of a heart attack in Normandy 5 weeks after the landing, the oldest man on the beach and the only general in the first wave. Sopity outlived him by decades, but his war began and ended with the same instrument, a radio, a voice, and a language that no German operator on Earth could decode. Why did German radio operators give up decoding American chatter? Because the chatter was not a code to be broken. It was a country, vast, noisy, informal, multilingual, and free, talking to itself across an ocean in every voice it had. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. If this story meant something to you, a like goes a long way. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter, and it helps them reach the people who want to hear them. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be honored to have you. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss the next one. And I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great uncle, I would love to hear about them in the comments. These stories belong to all of us. I will see you in the next one.